In this podcast, I'll be talking about 18th century biographies of Newton that were published first in Britain by British writers. Many of these, of course, were based on the first biography of Newton that was published, written by Fontenelle, which came out in French but was very, very quickly translated into English and went through several editions. But these other biographies, while using Fontenelle as their source material, added other bits of information and also their particular sort of spin. These were generally more popular works, and therefore their sort of relationship of the science to information about Newton's personal life was perhaps a bit different. And also they had a very British tendency to place Newton and his achievements above and beyond anyone else. They're not really great works of literature in their own right. They're produced really just as parts of collected works, biographies, dictionaries, collected biographies, and encyclopedias and so on. But they're important for the fact that they bring together these sort of different sets of materials about Newton's life, and particularly because they set the pattern and the sort of rhythm of Newton biographies really throughout the century and into the 19th and even into the 20th century. In terms of how they describe Newton's character, they very much take on what Conduit had said, and which was reproduced through Fontenelle. So again, we get this very sort of standard repetition of Newton as being really, everything you could want, paragon of all virtues and so on. Where the biographies become very important, I think, is the fact that they make certain anecdotes really canonical, things that will be repeated in all Newton biographies, things that become entirely familiar to us. Of course, nowadays, the anecdote that's really most instantly connected with Newton is the apple anecdote. But this is not one that was actually known. It wasn't published until the 19th century, even though it had been collected, apparently recorded from what Newton himself said by his niece, Catherine Conduit. But instead, there was a version of the anecdote that was quite similar. It did the same sort of job within the biography. And this was recorded by Henry Pemberton, again from what he said Newton had told him, and comes out in Pemberton's popularisation of Newton's scientific ideas, published in the year after his death. So he kind of sets the scene for this moment of discovery. He says that Newton had to leave London because of, or rather he had to leave Cambridge because of the plague. He went back to Walsall Manor, his childhood home. He goes out into the garden one day, he's solitary, thinking to himself, of course still a very young man at this period. And he then sort of makes this moment of inspiration, this leap from thinking about gravity as something that attracts objects on Earth, but thinking he can extend that to think about how it might attract objects to Earth beyond the Earth's own atmosphere. This is a very sort of important moment in explaining sort of Newton's general story, his ideas, the sort of pace and rhythm of his life. And we have this kind of solitary, inspirational, youthful moment, and also a moment where Newton is shown as being very sort of modest in his scientific ideas, even though he's made apparently this great leap of inspiration, this great moment of discovery. Pemberton tells us that he then, very quickly decides to test it out by doing calculations, but because he doesn't have very accurate numbers and figures for things like, the size of the Earth, his calculations don't come out accurately enough for him to think this is worth pursuing at the moment, so he quite happily just puts it aside rather than sort of fretting away at it. And Pemberton says that Newton only returns to these ideas once he's prompted by other people like Robert Hooke or Edmund Halley. So again, this is telling us something quite important about Newton and his work, and it's something that is taken from Pemberton and used in all subsequent biographies. Another anecdote that becomes very important, it's not well known now, but was very, very popular in the late 18th and in the 19th century, is the story of Newton's dog, Diamond. The idea of this story is really to illustrate the great sort of calmness and equanimity of Newton's temper, which is something that Conduit and all subsequent biographers went on about at great length. And the story goes, although there's no sort of authoritative source for it, it was said that Newton went out one day leaving a candle burning in his rooms in Cambridge, and that his little dog called Diamond upset the candle and caused a great fire, destroying all these papers and years' worth of work that Newton had been about to turn into a publication and then never did. And then really the main point of the story is that Newton comes back to his room, sees the horrific damage done, but rather than sort of flying into a rage or despairing or kicking the dog or anything like that, he just contents himself with saying, "Oh, Diamond, Diamond, thou little knowest what thou hast done." And that's it. So again, it becomes a very important way of describing how Newton behaves and how his personality and his scientific ideas interact. It isn't really in the nature of these kinds of biographies to be particularly reflective about their contents. They put forward these quite standard ideas as they become, painting a picture of Newton as this hero of British science. But they're also putting forward other bits of information, such as printing bits of correspondence that they find. And sometimes the two quite seriously contradict each other, but there's no sort of commenting on that. One quite nice example is in a letter that Newton wrote to Francis Aston, a young man, that is printed. And this gives evidence for example, for Newton's interest in alchemy, and also the fact that it puts across some very odd advice to this young man about personal conduct as he's about to go off on foreign travels. Later on, this is commented on, saying this says something perhaps quite odd about Newton's own character and his own personal conduct, but at the time it's just put forward and no comment is given on it at all. One of the perhaps most interesting of the biographies published at this period is that by Charles Hutton in his Biographical Dictionary, which comes out in 1790. And this is important, perhaps not so much for its contents, which is fairly similar to the other biographies and indeed repeats many of the same mistakes that come forward from these other works. But it's interesting from the fact that Hutton had the chance to see Newton's personal archive. And he's therefore able to use some more of the conduit material that Fontenelle didn't choose to use. And this includes anecdotes about Newton's childhood, being very interested in making mechanical devices and so on, and also some quotes and anecdotes about Newton when he was in his most creative period at Cambridge as a young man, describing moments of absent-mindedness and so on. You know, for example, beginning to get dressed and then having a sort of a momentary thought, sitting down on the edge of the bed, apparently for hours before he then sort of came to and thought about continuing and finishing getting dressed. Or stories about him just forgetting to eat, for example. So these are sort of ideas about the absent-minded scholar, which, although quite ancient, really kind of appeal to readers by this stage in the late 18th and early 19th century, when people are getting really quite interested in how childhood development works, how geniuses develop, how the sort of personality of the genius relates to their creativity and so on. So all of this, it's very apt, although it was written earlier in the century, that it's actually just coming out and being published at this period. So together, these biographies are very important for sort of setting the standard and the kind of rhythm of Newtonian biography. They present really, by and large, a very idealised figure, and one that very much suits the 18th century development of natural theology. For example, with the publication of Newton's letters to Bentley, we find that he fits in very well with this sort of idealised image of the rational Enlightenment figure, and also very much the Christian and even the Anglican figure of science that people really want by this period. So some of the more sort of complex parts of Newton's picture are just ignored by these biographies, although there are elements that are there to be taken and looked at in the following century. For example, hints given out in other publications, such as that by William Whiston, that talk about Newton's unorthodox religious beliefs, and also the fact that Newton had a bit of a difficult temper. He was a problematic person to deal with. So these elements are in the public sphere, but something that haven't yet really made it into the biography, certainly not something that's been reflected on, and that was a job for the following century.